Hi, I want to make a video on a thinking process and thinking about something like forever and thinking how you can be stuck in a process of thinking about forever and how that can have a negative consequence on your psychological well-being and thinking about things and the concept of contrivance, something that we call forever, but we don't necessarily um, to a certain extent understand the concept other than a very vague concept, something like perfect. Any word we use has a very strong disconnection from the reality that we're living in. Like we can understand to a certain extent when we describe how we exist, and when we exist, that we can only exist once we die. It might as well be we might as well just say that's the end of existence, and the idea of forever can be completely considered null and void, and it doesn't mean anything beyond a certain extent. And the same thing with describing something like perfect. Any word really, there's a disconnection between the word, the description, and understanding that it's just um, shapes, symbols, descriptions, noises coming out of our mouths to represent those symbols and describing those symbols and recognizing that these contrivances. But the idea of forever and thinking about forever, it's a nice way of recognizing just how trapped you are in this existence and realizing and thinking about these things like once I don't exist anymore. I have no context of my existence, and I have no context of my non-suffering, the best state I can be in. And once I'm here, yes. And um, same thing with imposition. You impose, and even yes, you're here. You didn't have to be here. And even if you enjoy your life, doesn't mean that you would have had to enjoy your life. Doesn't mean, if just because you exist and you happen to enjoy your life doesn't mean you had to exist to begin with, and there wouldn't be no you enjoying your life or not enjoying your life if you didn't exist anyway. You wouldn't have to have any context whatsoever if you didn't exist, but you happen to have existed, and now you're here stuck in the game, and that's no defense for you existing to begin with. And it's a trap game, and you're sort of stuck to these processes and the way things work and how things are working, and the way things are working are beyond your control to a certain extent, at least the fundamental mechanisms that are controlling the crude forces and the crude interactions of the very nature and the very foundation of this existence based on how things work. There's nothing you can do to change things to a certain extent to change the fundamental mechanisms and the way things work in this reality. There's nothing we can do about hunger and how that makes the existence, the creation of existence. Um, there's nothing you can do about the interaction that we have. There's nothing you can do about the hunger and how we need the hunger and the chase to make the life game worth living based on the thing that it's reality. The life game is something based on an interaction that the universe gave us, the reality gave us to exist to begin with. So it's something that happens, and there's nothing we can do to solve the sentient biological game, the biological mechanism, the biological drive that we've been given, and it can't work any other way because that's the only way it really functions. It can't function any other way. There's no singularity. There's nothing moving beyond a certain point. Things aren't working any other way if there were another mechanism, because they'd be working on the same mechanism of hunger and moving forward and competition and fighting for things as human beings are. They're not working on any other level. They're working on the same level. They're chasing towards something, getting something, moving on to finding something else to chase. And the chase is just part of the journey, and the journey is part of the reaching the end. It's a part of the momentum leading to some kind of end game, some kind of end that we finally reach. And the end is given no context once we die, and that's the end that we're reaching. And that just brings back to the point: if there's no context to an end that we're trying to achieve when we're alive, what's the point in existing to begin with? Exactly. And if you lived on forever, there'd be no meaning beyond a certain point because you'd just be doing the same old redundant thing over and over again, and it wouldn't serve any point or purpose other than psychological or physical masturbation, eternal, perpetual physical or psychological masturbation, and there would be nothing more to the game than just doing the same thing over and over again. And it would take to certain people, some time to recognize that fact before you look past the actual mechanism and see exactly what's happening. That's why in many cases people need a very negative event to happen to them to let them recognize just how bad existence can be. And even though they can have good times, they recognize that the bad times have more weight than the good times that we have. And the good times that we have hold very little significance or very little weight when it comes to the practical reality of this existence, especially since this existence is very based on the idea of deprivation, experiencing pain, because the expectation that we can have based on any kind of default is based on some kind of default sense of contentment that we have, and that's what we're always trying to reach when we're not in the basic state, because there's always something taking away from that state, and that's the only expectation we can have once we've reached a negative state, is to reach back to the content state that we have, being satisfied with my meal. And you can only be so satisfied with a meal once you've eaten too much, because then you become dissatisfied and food becomes repugnant and you don't want to eat food and your stomach's full and you want to puke. Same thing with you can only satisfy your sexual desires so much before you become completely disinterested in something like sex. You can only do so much. You can only satisfy your desire so much, and the contentment is what really matters. The satisfaction in the end is what really matters in the end, and that's what we're trying to reach. And that's the only expectation we can have, is having a full stomach, having a satisfied sexual satisfaction. Um, and once we've satisfied these sexual gratifications, our hunger, whatever, we've taken care of all of our bodily processes to a certain extent. We've reached some kind of contentment, and we only reach that for a small amount of time. Very rarely do we reach all these things all at once. And then once we do, we're just fighting back to get to that same contentment, that same default expectation of reaching some kind of zero, or close enough to some kind of zero. But even then, we're not reaching a zero, and that's what I mean. We're only reaching so far based on a basic expectation and a basic idea of what we can find by default by living to exist to begin with. And we can only do so much to reach that expectation. And our expectation is, by its very definition, a default expectation based on and it exists because the deprivation is the only thing that gives you an illusion of something changing is a deprivation, taking away from that default the default state of contentment that you may have. And that's all we're trying to fight towards. But it means something because you're fighting towards it, and it means something once you gain it. But the gain that you get is very fleeting, and you're right back to doing the same satisfaction, because that's the thing that makes life worth living. It means something, but you're on right back to chasing, because the satisfaction is what matters. The satisfaction is the same thing. Reaching that satisfaction only leads to wanting to chase something else, because once you're satisfied, unless you're satisfied by way of I'm ready to leave this life, and satisfying your desire by killing yourself or saying I'm done and I end up just not living anymore, giving up my will to live, there's no going beyond the mechanism of doing the same thing, redundant process of trying to satisfy desire. And that's what makes it mean nothing in the end, because you're just going right back onto the redundant process of satisfying that desire all over again. And I guess it's about finding the process of satisfying the desire, some kind of satisfaction in it, but you can only find so much satisfaction, and the satisfaction you're going to find out of that is just trying to make it a little less painful. But in the end, when you recognize that the satisfaction is based on the deprivation, and your satisfaction may not be as great once you get used to some processes, some painful processes. So you usually have to go through a greater amount of pain. There's either more pain or less pain, and it works on the same scale. And it usually requires more pain for the satisfaction to be more satisfying. And without that, the satisfaction won't be anywhere near as important, but it's the chase game that matters in the end anyway. And the chase game is what drives us, and the chase game is what creates the deprivation. That's the thing we're chasing. We're in the process of deprivation, chasing our satisfaction, when the satisfaction only leads to another chase. And the satisfaction means nothing, because the chase is all we're chasing. We're chasing a chase. We're chasing our tail. And that's the only thing we can do in this existence, is chase our tail. And we're chasing our tail over and over again. The tail is just another deprivation, and once we get satisfied, it means something, but it means something only to a certain extent, going right towards the next chasing. We're chasing another chase, and we're just chasing our tail around in circles, because that's all we can and will do in this existence, and we can't fundamentally beat that mechanism regardless of us thinking about it, because our very thinking is based on that mechanism. Anything we do is based on that mechanism. We can't be outside the mechanism. Even if we recognize the mechanism, we can't move beyond the mechanism. Me describing this as satisfying some kind of desire to get the point across, and whatever ego gratification. I'm getting something out of this. I'm getting some kind of satisfaction because I'm thrust into this game, interacting on a certain level based on a bunch of molecules and cells put together, interacting in a certain biological configuration, having a certain interaction based on the sentience in their interaction that I'm applying to it based on description, and it's working a certain way. And just because it's contrived based on my description of it doesn't mean that it's not working a certain way, because the way it's functioning can be seen in all sentient beings, and that's where you can get the connection from, that it's working a certain way, and it can't work any other way other than the way it's working right now. It's a very simplistic, redundant process that happens over and over again. And just because my words are disconnected from the description, the actual process, doesn't mean it's not happening the same way for everyone else, because we're just trying to do the same old redundant process over and over again of satisfying desires, and the satisfaction only being another chase game, another deprivation, another pain. Um, Creating. So once you satisfy, you're trying to look for something else to satisfy. So you're never satisfied. That's the thing. Life is always bringing more problems, but sometimes it seems like these problems have some kind of solution, but you're always stuck in limbo because you're never solving a solution. Some problems you're sort of stuck in a dead end. Sort of like recognizing the game and not looking beyond, not being able to look beyond the fact that you're just playing the same old redundant process. And that problem has no solution other than distraction. And that's not a direct problem dealing with the problem directly. That's just a way of distracting it, the problem. Exactly the description. It's distracting the problem. It's no direct solution. It's sort of like eating is a direct solution to solving your hunger. You're not distracting yourself, you're solving the problem. There's a way of solving all these problems except this illusion, this recognizing, and then overcoming the illusion and recognizing exactly the game that you're playing. And the game that you're playing is redundant process over and over again, leading to another redundant process based on a zero-sum game of playing the same redundant thing over and over again to satisfy something only to be deprivated right when you satisfy it. And then once you're deprivated again based on the wanting to chase again, you're right on to chasing the game again, and so on and so forth. You're going around in circles, chasing the same redundant process over and over again. And if you have nothing to chase, then you're chasing something anyway, because there's a problem if you're existing. If you're a sentient being, even if the sentience is distinguished from the reality that we're living in, the crude forces and this sentient thing that's against these crude forces, it's existing in the same mechanism. Because my biology is working on the same crude forces. My projection is created by these crude forces. It created it. It's based on it happened in this existence based on these interactions. And there's nothing I can do to fight those interactions except tolerate it. That's what we're stuck with. We're stuck with tolerating and feeling trapped. I know the person in front of me, I know the person in front of me is, going back to this equilibrium idea. Obviously, to a certain extent, that can be applied to this idea of life, but that doesn't mean what it is. That doesn't mean that these sentient beings are experiencing some kind of pain or suffering, and that's where the equilibrium can't be applied. But the thing is things are going to happen a certain way, and we can only do so much to mitigate against those things. And we can only do so much to change what is fundamentally a fundamental aspect of this existence that we're living in. And this existence can be changed only so much. And describing the equilibrium idea, we can only so this equilibrium thing, it goes back to the idea of someone compensating for something based on describing a person that has to go through a certain amount of pain to get used to a process, and then that person has to go through less pain because they already went through the pain, and that equalizes itself out because they went through a lot of pain to begin with, a gradual pain, and it makes up for the pain that a person experiences all at once. Or say you can only do so much, say if you're stuck in traffic on the road or something like that, whatever example, you can realize that the person in front of you is stuck behind the other person in front of you. If you're stuck in a line of traffic, the person in front of you is taking, just by being there, just by their existence. And that's the only thing that you need to have some kind of sense of responsibility, or some kind of sense of being some kind of imposer, is just by existing. And if you're not existing, you can take away, and just by not existing, that could be an imposition, not taken away from someone else. So your existence can either be more of an imposition or more of a non-imposition based on your individual being and what you've directly interacted with. So the person in line in traffic or in line, the person right in front of you is taking your imposition of moving forward. Say if a person is trying to push you forward, they're taking the direct imposition based on the person in the front of the line being the one causing, say, the slowdown or the slow moving traffic. that person's taking responsibility for the person in front being the one that's actually initially causing the interaction. But then again, you have to recognize that that person, putting yourself in their shoes and almost in a way, because you'd want it done to yourself, and you recognize that they have an experience as just as much as yours based on your knowledge or your preconceived notions or understanding about how people interact in knowing suffering and knowing situations you'd want to be in and situations you wouldn't want to be in. And to a certain extent, we all have to put ourselves in each other's shoes to a certain extent and understand, even though we can call them an a-hole or accuse them of something, or we can take action, it's going to happen, but to a certain extent, we can only do so much complaining before we recognize that they're just as much of a victim of their circumstance as I am a victim of my circumstance. But that doesn't mean that they can't take responsibility, because they're still in the circumstance. And if they can exist in a circumstance and they can be described as in a circumstance, then they can take responsibility for a circumstance. And they can, to a certain extent. So we can make distinctions between, say, someone accidentally doing something and not accidentally doing something. But to a certain extent, we can know when a person's intentionally doing something, regardless of what interaction may have happened. It's a matter of intention, and from our human perspective, as opposed to intentional versus accidental as a distinction. But it's also victims of circumstance, and that's what we all are. And since I'm a piece and they can create a circumstance and they're part of the circumstance, they can be just as much of to blame based on my description of deciding to blame them, my interaction decide to blame them. Can mean just as much. They can be just as responsible, because they're just a piece in the mechanism moving, and to a certain extent, their intentional or non-intentional interaction means very little. It's just another piece in the mechanism moving around, and something's going to happen to that piece, and that piece is going to take its course and it's going to move a certain way. And based on the way other things are interacting, that these pieces can interact with each other and have their own set of mutual consequences and interactions. And that's exactly what's happening in their interactions with existence. And based on our sentience and our projections of interaction, that's exactly what we can understand to a certain extent, how things are moving and interacting with the environment and the existence and the reality that we're living in. So, it goes back to this idea of vague interactions and vague concepts like forever, and that's what I started off as, and I went off on a tangent. But forever and things like that, feeling trapped based on these vague concepts of how things interact to a certain extent, and how things are moving and interacting with certain things, and knowing how stuck you are, thinking of infinite regression. But we need to realize to a certain extent that forever, sort of like we can perceive like infinite, and thinking things like that, we can conceive something like nothing, because we experience that. We actually do experience that consciously when it's an instantaneous jump. And that's where I think of existing in infinite regression, because there's no context once you die, and it almost seems like once you're dead, the only thing you can do once you're dead is come to life, when it comes to a dichotomy to not existing psychologically or sentiently, consciously experiencing. So forever, just as much of a concept like infinite, can be applied vaguely to a certain situation, but it can't be the idea of something infinitely happening or occurring. To a certain extent, can only be vaguely described to a certain situation, describing certain situations. Forever in and of itself as a concept can't exist inside this reality, because it's something that hasn't existed, based on its own vague definition of something that happens perpetually. But beyond a certain extent, we can't necessarily describe that situation, because it's beyond. It's a concept that we can describe, but it's just a description based on a bunch of other vague thoughts, based on more things more closely connected to this reality. So even if this concept seems like it's beyond our reality, it's not beyond our reality to a certain extent, because it's based on a bunch of less vague ideas that are more intertwined in this existence than the actual idea that it makes up. So the pieces are more important than the actual thing that it makes, because the thing that it makes doesn't have any weight, as opposed to the other vague ideas that make up, say, a vaguer idea, such as infinite and this and that, these other words and concepts that come together and converge into an idea like forever, and those things are a little more significant, and they'll carry a little more weight than some vague concept further away from the actual ties to reality than reality itself. So something like forever and infinite mean very little in the concept or in the interaction and describing reality, because they're further away. They're vaguer concepts based on vague concepts to begin with. So you're going a little vaguer and you're mixing different concepts and you're coming to different conclusions. Sort of like you can perceive time travel and come up with paradoxes. You can think of time travel, but that's where the initial logical um, problem comes up, is when you start thinking of something such as distortions in time and how time works to begin with, manipulating this idea of what movement is and how things are interacting and how things are existing in a different time or different dimensions or different timelines, parallel timelines, and thinking of some kind of physical machine that can take you back and interact with those timelines or whatever it may be in interaction. You have to understand that these concepts are based on other concepts converging into one concept and having a certain implication and creating certain conundrums based on just mixing of very vague concepts, creating a vaguer concept, causing things like paradoxes and conundrums, and causing problems that don't need to exist based on a contrivance that doesn't exist in reality to begin with. And even if that contrivance, the thing does exist, doesn't mean that there can be contrivances to that certain situation. To a certain situation describing something. And I guess sort of like an equal and opposite reaction. You press something and it has an equal and opposite reaction to you because I'm interacting with something. Otherwise, I would have gone through something. Because I'm interacting with my weight. I have a certain interaction with the weight and the air, and the interactions with the interactions that I have with the atmosphere around me and things like that. I guess that's just something I wanted to throw in there. Sorry. So yeah, I think that's really all I wanted to mention. So forever and things like that, I think nothing is more of at least an understandable concept, instantaneousness kind of perception, because it can be directly described based on experience. Like forever is a vague concept that we can't really apply based on its vague definition. But its definition means nothing in describing a vague concept to begin with, because it's a vague concept with a vague definition. But based on a definition itself, it doesn't mean much of anything to a certain extent. It means something, but it means something based on a bunch of contrivances and unknowns that we contrive based on conundrums and paradoxes and contrivances based on a lot of other vague concepts that we have. So it doesn't really exist on a certain level. And if I have anything else to say on the subject, I'll mention it in another video. So thank you, and until next time, bye.